This is the 6th volume of an 8-volume autobiography to the age of 30. It's called Oxford Undergraduate, and it tells of my life at Oxford between 1960 and 1963. Here I am returning to my college, Worcester College. Worcester was a small college on the edge of the university, and it was founded in the 15th century, but refounded, and most of its important buildings were 18th century. This is the entrance with the dining hall on the left and the chapel on the right, and the old library near the clock at the top. It was not particularly distinguished intellectually, but it was well known in Oxford because it had probably the most beautiful gardens. It had a nice lake where you can see the old 18th century building behind through the lake. On this lake various events would take place, including parts of Shakespearean plays, and beyond the lake there were playing grounds and a very nice half-mile walk. And so very often every day, with a friend or by myself, I would go for a walk round the lake, thinking or talking. And this is a tree which was there when I was there, and this is 40 years later. And many of my thoughts were formed through the conversations, the breaks between formal work, alongside this lake. The college itself had been founded as a set of Benedictine hostels in the 15th century, and they were still there. They were for different Benedictine orders in each of these different staircases. My staircase is the second from the left, is the entrance to it. And some people say that the system of staircases in Oxford and Cambridge derived from this particular arrangement here. And they would form little communities, as they did still when I went and spent my second year on that staircase. The college was refounded and added to with Hawksmoor buildings. Fortunately, they ran out of money, so they couldn't pull down the medieval cottages as was planned. And so this is the 18th century Hawksmoor building with the Provost's Lodge at the far end, and my first year tutorial room on the second floor towards the right. The oldest part, the medieval part, was built round a huge refectory and kitchens, and this is the chimney for the kitchens, which I didn't realize at the time was very old. But my room in my second year was the first window as you go up beside the chimney, and so I was living in a 15th century room, as I discovered to my delight later. I went back to this room, and of course it seemed rather small and poky, but it was the centre of my emotional life. The college was your home, and here I could entertain people to drinks and tea and coffee and chat to my girlfriends, and I began my intense interest in filing systems, and bought an in and out tray and so on. Now I'd come to Oxford from Sedbergh School, and I came in my first year to live in digs owned by the college in Beaumont Street, number 5 Beaumont Street, and here many years later I came to revisit it. This was a huge escape from my previous existence because I had a nice large room and could entertain and have a real social life. The college, when I went there, was changing very rapidly. Even 5 years before, it was one where there were much more old-fashioned attitudes. My teachers are on the top there, and people are dressed for a specific occasion, but they tended to be older because they'd done civil service, and they tended to be from public schools. In my time, we had stopped doing civil service, and there were many more grammar school boys. So it was a much more mixed, socially mixed college just as I arrived. This is the size of the college. I'm third from the left on the bottom, wearing jeans, which was unusual at the time. I was fairly left-wing, partly thanks to my mother's influence. In the centre of the picture is the provost or head of the college, Sir Oliver Franks, and some of the other teachers along the front, and many of my close friends with whom I've remained friends there. The college was not just about education, it was about everything else, sport and music and games and so on. And here I joined the football team, my favourite game, and I'm on the top right in the football team there. And every winter we would go out and play against other colleges and against Oxford, Cambridge colleges and so on. I didn't take it very seriously, but it was relaxation. The most important thing, in many ways, was friendship. And here we're out above Oxford with my history tutorial partner and friend Paul Hyams in the middle, and another friend from Lancashire, John Monks, and me on the left, and one of my short-term girlfriends in the middle. The really pivotal event was my first girlfriends, and in my second term I met this young Hungarian lady who was a year younger than me but much more mature, and she introduced me to a whole new world of literature and art and music from her much more cultured London background, much more sophisticated, and we had an absolutely idyllic couple of terms together in Oxford while she was there at St Clair's. Of course, in Oxford, one of the things you did, as in Cambridge, was to punt. And here I am, my hair growing long. This is probably my second summer, my second year, hair growing long, punting down the Charwell, very near to the school where I had been at school, at the Dragon School. And so I would take my girlfriends and other friends, and we'd go out with picnics up the River Charwell. This was the area where Dodgson had written the Alice books, just further up from here, and this is the kind of epitome picture of an Oxford undergraduate life. It was only, of course, a tiny part of our lives, but it was delightful all the same, and the summers seemed bliss. There were many other things which we were doing, of course. It was like Sedbergh School, absolutely packed with activities. Here is part of the programme for one term: the Humanist Group, the Labour Club, the Badminton Club, the cross-country university trials, the Cosmos, and then various films that were going on at the time. In fact, I remember going to one or two of those films that I noticed above. And we would keep diaries and note all the busy things we were doing at the bottom, showing my religious interests. I noticed Holy Communion and choral evensong, but also of a party, someone's party, from 6 to 8. And so we would try and fit in as much social, cultural, and other life alongside working. I'd work for 6 or 7 hours a day. The rest of the time we could do what we liked, including a lot of going to the cinema, because this was a time when there were masses of fascinating films at the equivalent of the Arts Cinema in Oxford, which was down from my college. So I could go to Richard III or The Secret Life of Walter Mitty or Strangers on a Train. All sorts of classic cinema events were going on. And there were many special events, for example, poetry and jazz reading. And at that time, Oxford attracted really outstanding poets and jazz musicians. Here we have famous people like Danny Abbs, Laurie Lee, Adrian Mitchell, Christopher Logue, really the top poets, and Mrs. Pasternak Slater. So I went to this and to other cultural events. My digs were next to the Oxford Playhouse, and so I could easily go to the theatre as well. And I particularly remember this Murder and Mozart, because I suddenly had the shock of encountering live Mozart at an impressionable age, and from then on I loved this kind of music, and no doubt we had a glass of wine to go with the occasion, which helped with it. I myself didn't get seriously involved in acting, which was something some of my friends did, but Worcester had a quite well-known small troupe of actors who did Shakespeare plays in the summer and other plays, and on a couple of occasions I took a very small part in the Shakespeare plays, strumming my guitar and forgetting all my lines, no doubt. I was also involved with quite a few philanthropic and international activities. This is the Cosmos Club, which was the local branch of the United Nations, and we had some excellent speakers and had a chance to meet top diplomats and top members of parliament. And this, no doubt, could also have led us through these contacts into certain activities after we left the university. It was a gateway into the civil service and so on. I was particularly interested in poverty, what I'd seen in Calcutta as a late teenager, and so I would go to freedom from hunger lectures on world food and population. I became interested in population problems, and I was a volunteer in the very early days when Oxfam was just starting in Oxford, and I went and helped address envelopes and so on. I also organised social events with my friends. My most serious party with my first girlfriend was here in the Upper Newman Rooms, and we had to have permission from the university to have parties because we had music and drink and so on in university premises. So this is the permission. In the background to all my Oxford life, and particularly the first 2 years as an undergraduate, was religion. Here is the college chapel, a well-known Victorian, highly decorated William Morris Rossetti kind of chapel. An old photograph, but it was rather like this when I was there, and so many evenings I'd go and take confession and go to the weekly services. And this is something which I was influenced by. As well as the college chapel, there were many societies and churches in the university, and I used to go to St Aldate's Church, which was a very evangelical church with Keith de Berry, a very storming pastor, and also I belonged to something called the Oxford Inter-College Collegiate Christian Union, OICU, and so this was a very devout phase in my life, and I used to keep notes and make efforts to try and pray for my friends and understand the Bible and read selected passages, and this is one of my notebooks at that time, recording my thoughts and feelings about religion. I continued also to go to the boys' religious camps, the Varsities and Public Schools camps, and here I am grasping a Bible in the middle with some of the officers. These were people from universities and public school masters, and the boys sitting round in the evening talking about God and religion. This went on very powerfully during my first 2 years at the university, but my last undergraduate year I began to question it all and more or less gave up, except the social side of it. We, from Worcester, used to run Borstal camps. Here I am in the middle with the drying up cloth, with the Catholic padre on my right, and a little beyond that the Anglican padre, my friend Alec Graham, who later became a bishop, and we used to go up to the Yorkshire moors with Borstal boys and then go back to their Borstal. So it was mainly doing good rather than very evangelical. The main source for all this account, as in the other accounts, are letters. I wrote almost every week back to my parents in India, as I'd done since I was at preparatory school, and this correspondence back and forth is very revealing. Alongside the letters to my parents were also letters to my girlfriends, and the first one, my first girlfriend, like me, was a great fan of Tolkien. So here I have my rendering of a Tolkien hobbit, or at least rather an ent, an inhabitant of the forests, a walking tree, and some beautiful damsel here, which I drew for my parents, the Lady Galadriel, it appears to be. And so I wrote to my parents explaining my literary, historical, and other interests and thoughts. These letters describe the inner life. I went for a walk this afternoon through Witham Woods, north of Oxford. It was misty, and the further trees looked like elfin figures, slim and immense in the distance. So here are my attempts to try and polish up my prose style and keep my parents informed how their money was being spent on me in support of my grant at Oxford. And most importantly, perhaps, were the wonderful letters I got from my mother every week. It became a sort of journal or diary for her, which I hope to publish later. And these recounted life on a tea estate, but also took a great deal of interest and concern about me and my girlfriends and what I was developing intellectually, and we started to become equal partners in our interest in history. Oxford was really a wonderful eye-opener for me. It was the first time I was able to be an adult and to go out for drinks and order my life. And it was also magical, not just the world of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who were both at Oxford at this time. And this is my rendering of a medieval manuscript of a poem from The Lord of the Rings, which took me off into magic land. But I even ventured into poetry, and this is a bit of my poetry. I joined one or two poetry societies and heard great poets, and met Robert Graves and others, and my own poetry was mediocre, rather derivative from others like Dylan Thomas, but I enjoyed writing it, and it expressed some of my inner thoughts, and a few of these are in the book. I also at that time did a little bit of artwork. Here are some strange Freudian interpreted dreams, or Jungian, expressing my inner feelings. The second one at the bottom is called Vicious Circle, and just one or two of these are in the book as well. The main official point, of course, was to be studying a subject, and I was reading history. So I used to go to lectures in the history faculty. You didn't have to go to lectures, and you just went to the ones which you thought were good. And I went to some excellent lectures throughout my time there, 2 or 3 series a term, and kept very extensive and detailed notes. And this was the best history undergraduate course in the UK and perhaps in the world at that time. But it wasn't the university level that was important, it was the college level. And here again I was immensely fortunate to have wonderful teachers. For my medieval and Anglo-Saxon I had James Campbell, who was a superb teacher, only about 8 years older than me, and a prize fellow and a wonderful teacher, and also a great expert on those periods. And he inspired me, and later on I made an interview of his life, from which this picture is taken. I then moved on through my syllabus from medieval to modern, and my teacher was Harry Pitt, another superb teacher, someone very argumentative, very learned, very kind, and I really enjoyed his supervisions and became a friend and remained a friend through until his death a few years ago. So these were the main teachers, but there were many other people who intellectually influenced me greatly. One of them was Brian Harrison, who was about 4 years older than me, and I met through an accident. And he later became the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography, among other things, Sir Brian Harrison, and he was a fantastically well-organized researcher, and he lent me all his undergraduate notes, which helped me a great deal in my course and later influenced my postgraduate work by teaching me the methods of breaking down information and reassembling it in various ways. So in the first term we did Gibbon and Macaulay, and here are some notes on The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, which I obviously enjoyed, and the other person at that time I studied was de Tocqueville, who became a lifelong hero of mine, and I later wrote a book about him, and Harry Pitt was particularly good on Tocqueville. The essays start simply. Here is something on Macaulay in my first term, and you can see the handwriting changing, the degree of comprehension, and above all my maturity, intellectually and emotionally, altering over those 3 years. It was a great difference between the first and the end of the third years. I had grown up more or less into an intellectually mature person. When I came to examine in my last year, the examinations, I went through all my notes of 3 years, which I'd carefully kept, and here are my underlinings as I tried to memorize what I'd discovered in second and first years in detail. I became particularly interested in economic history and in the 16th and 17th century, and this is an essay about that time. And this is a paper I did on 16th, 17th century economic history, which became the background to my later research on that period. And I had, again, excellent teachers who had written textbooks on this period. And one of the essays that really excited me was the one on the causes of the Industrial Revolution. Here I'm going through whether it was a rising birth rate or a falling death rate, which might have been one of the contributing factors. And this became a lifelong question for me, and I wrote a couple of books around this theme of population and economy later in my life, and the seeds were sown both at Sedbergh to a certain extent and certainly at Oxford. Then I came to the final examinations in the third year, and these are my essay notes. I divided up the time and each of the chosen essays. For example, what evidence of industrial and commercial prosperity was there in England, and then I wrote down a plan for writing it before I started writing. I worked very hard in a very organized way and did well enough to be examined for a first, vivaed for a first. Some of the papers here in the report, paper 2, my favourite period was Alpha Beta, which was very good, and political theory, which I very much enjoyed, Alpha Beta as well. But some were betas, and as a result I didn't get a first. But I did well enough to go on later, as we'll see, to do a doctorate. Alongside the major time in the university and the college, I was going up in the holidays to the Lake District, particularly spending time when my parents were home on leave on a couple of summers. And here, with my room above the porchway there, and our new dog, a collie, beside me, I'm reading and no doubt working, but enjoying time in the Lake District, where we would go off to the seaside and have picnics, go beyond the Duddon River, where we used to go and swim and look at salmon, and then to the coast to swim and collect things from the seashore. So these were relaxing times, but also times to refresh the relationship with my mother and sisters. It was a particularly rich and wonderful contrast. Here I am again meditating and with our dog, a time when most of my time was spent walking around, but also a lot of fishing still. I was still a very keen trout fisherman, and when my father was home we'd go fishing together. And I was still very keen on one or two other things, particularly music and pop music. And so with friends I'd join a little skiffle group and go to local coffee bars which were just opening up. This was the great time of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the new pop era. So a very good time to be having a guitar and playing with your friends in the alongside the jukeboxes and coffee bars of the early 1960s. So finally I graduated from Oxford. I didn't quite achieve a friend's wishes, who wished me a happy 21st birthday and gave me a first-class degree and various prizes in sports and games. But I did really enjoy my time as an undergraduate and was fortunate enough, as we'll see in the next volume, to come back and do another 3 years in the same college and the same university.